Sign the papers, Coco, and maybe I'll let you keep the Toyota. The words hit like ice water, but Coco Ben kept her pen steady as she signed her name for the final time as Mrs. Davidson. Around the mahogany conference table, David's smirk widened while his lawyer shuffled through documents that would strip away 15 years of her life in legal terminology. Actually, David continued, his voice dripping with the condescension she'd grown to despise. On second thought, Veronica needs a car for her yoga classes. You can take the bus. Veronica giggled, a sound like breaking glass that had replaced Coco's laughter in David's world 6 months ago. 23 years old, blonde, and currently wearing the Tiffany bracelet Coco had admired in a shop window just last Christmas. The bracelet David had said they couldn't afford right now. David, please, Coco whispered, but her voice cracked on his name. Please what? He leaned back in his chair, designer suit immaculate, wedding ring already absent from his finger. Please pretend you weren't a financial burden for the last 5 years. Please pretend you contributed anything besides your little craft projects. Coco's hands trembled as she thought of the pottery studio she'd built in their garage, had built in what used to be their garage. Every piece she'd sold at local markets, every commissioned vase, every small victory David had dismissed as playing with mud. Those craft projects paid for your mother's cancer treatments, Coco said quietly. David's jaw tightened. Ancient history. And frankly, Coco, you should be grateful. I'm giving you a fresh start to figure out who you are without my support. The lawyer cleared his throat. Mrs. Davidson, sorry, Ms. Ben, you'll need to vacate the premises by Friday. Mr. Davidson is generously allowing you to take your personal belongings. How generous, Coco murmured, thinking of the wedding china her grandmother had left her, now legally David's property. Oh, and Coco. Veronica spoke for the first time, her voice saccharine. I hope you don't mind, but I already redecorated the master bedroom. That floral wallpaper was just so dated. The wallpaper Coco had carefully chosen and hung herself during their 3rd year of marriage, when they'd talked about filling that room with children's voices someday. Coco stood slowly, gathering what remained of her dignity along with her purse, a worn leather bag David had once called embarrassing in public. She looked at the man she'd loved since college, the man who'd promised her forever, the man who'd held her while she cried over 3 miscarriages. I hope she makes you happy, David. He laughed, actually laughed. Happier than I ever was settling for mediocrity. Coco walked toward the door, each step echoing in the sterile law office. Behind her, she heard Veronica whisper something that made David chuckle, and the sound followed her into the hallway like a curse. 3 hours later, Coco sat in her studio apartment, all she could afford on her pottery income, staring at the lottery ticket she'd bought that morning. Wednesday's numbers, 7, 14, 23, 31, 45, Powerball 18. She'd chosen them randomly, desperately, the way drowning people grasp for driftwood. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Carmen. How did it go? Coco typed back, I'm officially poor and alone. But I'm free. Want me to come over? Not tonight. I need to figure out how to rebuild everything. She set the phone aside and pulled her laptop closer, opening the bookmarked page she'd been avoiding. Starting over at 38, A Single Woman's Guide to Financial Independence. The lottery ticket lay forgotten on her coffee table, next to a half-eaten sandwich and the final divorce papers that had just made her Coco Ben again, a woman with $4 to $7 in her checking account and a heart full of rage she was too polite to express. Outside her window, rain began to fall on San Diego, each drop like the tears she refused to let David's cruelty squeeze from her eyes. She'd cried enough for one lifetime. Now she needed to learn how to fight. Coco opened her laptop and began typing. Pottery instructor positions, San Diego area. But as she scrolled through listings that offered barely enough to cover rent, her eyes drifted to that innocent slip of paper on her table. Numbers that meant nothing, purchased in a moment of desperation at the corner store where the clerk had asked if she was okay because she looked like she'd seen a ghost. Maybe she had. The ghost of the woman she used to be, before 15 years of marriage taught her to make herself smaller and smaller until she nearly disappeared entirely. Coco picked up the lottery ticket and held it to the window, watching rain blur the numbers. 7, 14, 23, 31, 4 to 5. Powerball 18. Tomorrow, she'd check these numbers. Tomorrow, she'd start building a new life from nothing. Tomorrow, she'd prove to David and everyone who pitted her that Coco Ben was stronger than they'd ever imagined. Tonight, she'd let herself hope for just one small miracle. Hey, my friend, hope you're doing well, Drop a comment and let me know how you're feeling about this story so far and where you are watching from. Some stories are too close to my heart to share on YouTube. I send those, along with little life lessons and surprises, to my email circle. If you'd like to be part of it, you can join with the link in the description. The ticket fluttered in her fingers like a butterfly's wing, fragile and beautiful and carrying the weight of impossible dreams. What Coco didn't know, what she couldn't know as she set that piece of paper back on her table and tried to fall asleep on a couch that would become her bed for the foreseeable future, was that those 6 numbers would change everything. Not just her bank account. Not just her address or her wardrobe or her ability to buy groceries without counting pennies. Those numbers would change her into someone David Davidson could never have imagined. Someone who would make him wish he'd never heard the name Coco Ben. But that transformation would begin tomorrow, with a phone call that would make her legs give out and her heart stop beating for several terrifying, wonderful seconds. Tonight, she was still just a divorced woman with $47 and a lottery ticket, dreaming of a future where David's laughter couldn't follow her anymore. Coco's phone rang at 6:47 a.m., jerking her awake on the narrow couch that had become her bed. The number was unfamiliar, probably a debt collector, though she couldn't imagine what debt since David had taken everything. "Ms. Ben." The voice was professional, excited. "This is Jennifer Walsh from the California State Lottery Commission. I have some extraordinary news." Coco's heart stopped, then started again, hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. "Are you there? You purchased a Powerball ticket yesterday at Murphy's Corner Market on Elm Street. The numbers 7, 14, 23, 31, 45, and Powerball 18. Coco's hand shook so violently she nearly dropped the phone. Yes. Those were my numbers. Congratulations, Ms. Ben. You've won the Powerball jackpot. $257 million. The words didn't make sense. They hung in the air like foreign language, refusing to translate into reality. Coco stared at the lottery ticket still lying on her coffee table, those innocent numbers that had transformed overnight into the most powerful weapon she'd never known she needed. Are you still there? Yes. I'm here. Coco's voice came out as a whisper. Did you say 257 million? Yes. The lump sum after taxes will be approximately $153 million. We'll need you to come to our regional office today to begin the verification process. And Ms. Ben, I'd strongly recommend keeping this information private until we can arrange proper financial and legal counsel. Coco hung up and stared at the ceiling of her tiny apartment, listening to her upstairs neighbor's shower running and a dog barking somewhere in the distance. Normal sounds for a normal Thursday morning in a world that had just tilted completely off its axis. $153 million. More money than David made in a lifetime. More money than his precious Veronica had ever dreamed of. More money than everyone who had looked at her with pity yesterday could fathom. Coco's first instinct was to call Carmen, to scream with joy, to share this impossible miracle. Her second instinct made her pause, remembering Jennifer Walsh's advice about privacy. Her third instinct made her smile for the first time in months. She thought about David's face when he'd called her pottery playing with mud. She thought about Veronica's giggle and her comment about the bedroom wallpaper. She thought about David's mother, Patricia, who had whispered to her church friends that Coco was too common for her son and had probably trapped him with pregnancy promises that never materialized. Coco stood slowly, walking to her bathroom mirror. The woman staring back looked exhausted, defeated, ordinary. Brown hair that needed highlighting, worry lines that makeup couldn't hide, clothes from discount stores because David controlled their finances with an iron fist. But behind her brown eyes, something new flickered to life. Not revenge, not yet. Planning. Strategy. The same careful mind that had built a pottery business from nothing, that had organized 15 years of David's social calendar, that had managed their household on increasingly tight budgets while he spent freely on Veronica's friendship. Coco showered, dressed in her best outfit, a black dress she'd bought for David's company Christmas party 3 years ago, and drove to the lottery office. The verification process took 4 hours. 4 hours of paperwork, identity confirmation, and financial advisors who kept calling her Miss Ben with increasing respect as the reality of her win became official. "We recommend you establish a trust," said Mr. Peterson, the lottery's financial advisor. "For privacy and tax purposes. You can operate completely anonymously through the trust structure." "Anonymous," Coco repeated. "No one would know it was me. Not unless you choose to reveal yourself. Many winners prefer complete privacy, especially with jackpots of this size. Coco signed the papers for the Ben Family Trust and walked out of the building as one of the wealthiest women in California. Her phone buzzed with a text from Carmen. "Hope your first day of job hunting went better than expected. Love you, sis." Coco stared at the message and typed back, "It went very well. I think I found exactly what I was looking for." That evening, Coco sat in her studio apartment with a yellow legal pad and began making lists. Not of things she wanted to buy, but of information she needed to gather. David's weaknesses. His company's structure. His new life with Veronica. She started with what she knew. David worked as a senior marketing director for Hartwell Industries, a mid-sized consulting firm. He bragged for years about being indispensable, about his client relationships, about his pipeline of future business. Coco opened her laptop and began researching. Hartwell Industries was privately held, family-owned for 3 generations. But like many traditional businesses, they'd struggled with digital transformation. Their stock portfolio, according to public filings, was conservative but profitable. She researched David's boss, Michael Hartwell. His LinkedIn showed a man nearing retirement age, with 2 daughters who worked in non-profit sectors rather than taking over the family business. A man who might be interested in selling to the right buyer. Coco made a note, Hartwell succession planning, investigate acquisition possibilities. Next, she looked up the mansion David and Veronica were renting in La Jolla. The property belonged to Harrison Real Estate Holdings, owned by an elderly couple in Arizona. The listing history showed it had been on the market twice in the past 5 years. Owners who might be motivated sellers if approached correctly. Another note, Morrison Property, research owners' motivation to sell. Coco's phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, her old reflexes kicked in, the automatic anxiety about what she'd done wrong now, what he needed from her. She almost didn't answer. But curiosity won. "Coco. Thank God. I need a favor." Coco's grip tightened on the phone. 24 hours ago, this man had called her a financial burden and laughed at her tears. Now he needed a favor. What kind of favor, David? "It's Patricia. Mom. She's in the hospital, had a heart episode this morning. I'm at Scripps Memorial with Veronica, but I can't find Mom's insurance cards anywhere. I think they might still be in that box of papers you took. Could you?" "I'll look," Coco interrupted, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. "If I find them, I'll bring them to the hospital." "Coco, thank you. I know yesterday was difficult, but..." "David, I'll look for the insurance cards. That's all." She hung up and sat quietly for several minutes. Patricia Davidson, who had made snide comments about Coco's common background and lack of college degree. Patricia, who had suggested David might be happier with someone more sophisticated. Patricia, who had conveniently forgotten that Coco's pottery income had paid for her cancer treatments when David's insurance fell short. Coco found Patricia's insurance cards in exactly the place David expected. She had always been the organized one, the keeper of important documents, the person who managed the details of their lives while he took credit for the results. At Scripps Memorial, Coco found David in the cardiac wing waiting room, still in his work clothes, tie loosened. Veronica sat beside him, scrolling through her phone, looking bored rather than concerned. "Coco." David stood as she approached, and for a moment, she saw something vulnerable in his face. "Thank you for coming. The doctors say she's stable, but..." Coco handed him the insurance cards. "How is she?" "Scared. Asking for you, actually." David's voice was quiet. "She keeps saying she wants to apologize for something." Veronica looked up from her phone. "I told David she's probably just medicated and confused. Old people say weird things in hospitals." Coco looked at Veronica, really looked at her. 23 years old, beautiful in that effortless way that came from never having worried about money or security. Her manicured nails tapped impatiently against her phone case, and Coco realized that this girl saw David's mother's heart attack as an inconvenience in her day. "I'd like to see her," Coco said. "If that's okay." David nodded. Room 314. "Coco, what you did today, coming here, it means a lot." Coco walked down the hospital corridor, each step echoing with the strange irony of her situation. Yesterday, David had stripped her of everything. Today, she was worth more than he could imagine. Tomorrow, she would begin the careful process of taking back everything he had taken from her, plus interest. But tonight, she would sit with Patricia Davidson and accept whatever apology a frightened old woman needed to make. Because Coco Ben had been raised to show kindness to people in pain, regardless of how they had treated her. The woman she was becoming could afford to be generous. She had all the time and resources in the world to plan her next moves. Patricia was awake when Coco entered the room, looking small and fragile against the white hospital sheets. Her eyes filled with tears when she saw Coco. "I'm so sorry," Patricia whispered. "I said terrible things. I was jealous of how much David loved you, and I was cruel." Coco sat in the chair beside the bed and took Patricia's hand. "You don't need to apologize. You were protecting your son the way you thought was best." "No, I was protecting my own pride. You were good to him, good to all of us, and I let my prejudices make me treat you badly." Patricia's voice grew stronger. "David made a mistake. A terrible mistake." Coco squeezed the older woman's hand gently. "What's done is done, Patricia. Focus on getting better." But as Coco sat in that hospital room, listening to Patricia's regrets and apologies, she thought about David's terrible mistake and how much worse it was about to become. Outside in the waiting room, David was checking his phone, probably reading work emails while his mother recovered from a heart attack. Veronica had moved to the vending machines, more interested in snacks than the family crisis unfolding around her. Neither of them could imagine that the broke ex-wife they pitied was about to become the most dangerous person in their lives. Coco Ben had always been underestimated. Tomorrow, she would begin showing them exactly how costly that mistake would be. 2 weeks after Patricia's heart attack, Coco sat in the law offices of Blackstone and Associates, not the strip mall attorney who had handled her divorce, but the most prestigious firm in San Diego. The kind of place David had always claimed was out of their league. "Ms. Ben," said Victoria Blackstone, senior partner, her silver hair immaculate and her Hermes suit probably worth more than Coco's old annual salary. "I understand you're interested in some rather complex acquisition strategies." Coco had spent those 2 weeks transforming herself. New wardrobe, elegant, expensive, but understated. Professional makeup consultation. A financial advisor who specialized in ultra-high net worth clients. She looked like a woman who belonged in offices like this. "I want to acquire Hartwell Industries," Coco said simply. "Quietly. Through intermediaries. The current ownership should never know my identity." Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly. She'd handled eccentric wealthy clients before, but something about Coco's calm determination was different. Hartwell is a well-established family business. They are not publicly traded, and to my knowledge, they are not seeking buyers. "Everyone has a price, Ms. Blackstone. I want you to find theirs." "May I ask why this particular company?" Coco met her gaze steadily. "They employ someone I'd like to redirect." Victoria smiled, the kind of smile that meant she understood exactly what Coco wasn't saying. "I see. And your budget for this redirection?" $50 million. To start. And if they won't sell? Then we make them an offer they can't refuse. I want you to research Michael Hartwell's retirement plans, his daughter's financial situations, any debt the company carries, upcoming challenges they might face. Find their pressure points. Victoria made notes on her legal pad. This level of acquisition typically takes 6 to 8 months. "I have time." "And you mentioned intermediaries." Coco pulled out a manila folder. "I want everything done through a series of shell companies. Create enough layers that even if someone tries to trace the ownership, they'll hit dead ends. Can you do that?" "Ms. Ben, creating complex corporate structures is what we do best. But I have to ask, are you certain about this level of investment in what appears to be a personal matter?" Coco thought about David's laughter in the divorce attorney's office. About Veronica's dismissive giggle. About 15 years of being made to feel small and worthless. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." That afternoon, Coco drove to La Jolla to see the mansion David and Veronica were renting. She parked across the street, watching through designer sunglasses as Veronica pulled into the driveway in her BMW, the car David had bought her while claiming he and Coco needed to be more careful with money. The house was stunning, Mediterranean-style architecture, perfectly manicured gardens, an infinity pool visible through the side gates. The kind of place Coco had dreamed of when she and David were newlyweds, before she learned that dreams were luxuries they couldn't afford. Or rather, luxuries David wouldn't afford for her. Coco's phone buzzed with a text from her new private investigator, Franklin Chen. Harrison Real Estate Holdings research complete. Owners are Charles and Ruth Harrison, ages 78 and 76, living in Phoenix. Property is one of 4 rental investments. Charles has early-stage Parkinson's. Ruth has been handling finances but struggling with the workload. They've been quietly trying to liquidate their real estate portfolio to pay for his care. Coco typed back, offer them 20% above market value for immediate sale. Cash purchase, close in 2 weeks. That's about 8 million for a property worth 6.5. You sure? I'm sure. Coco was about to drive away when the front door of the mansion opened and David stepped out. He was dressed casually, khakis and a polo shirt, but even from across the street, she could see the confidence in his posture. The satisfaction of a man who had gotten everything he wanted. He walked to his car, a new Mercedes that hadn't been in their driveway when they were married. As he backed out, he was laughing at something, probably a phone call with a friend, sharing jokes about his lucky escape from marriage to boring Coco. Coco watched him drive away and made a decision that would change everything. She called Victoria Blackstone. Ms. Blackstone. Coco Ben. I want to accelerate the Hartwell timeline. Whatever it takes. Ms. Ben, we haven't even completed our initial research. Then research faster. Hire more people. I want Michael Hartwell to receive an acquisition offer within the month. That's extremely aggressive. It could raise suspicions. Good. I want him off balance. People make poor decisions when they are rushed. Coco hung up and called Franklin Chen. I want you to investigate David Davidson. I want to know everything. His credit score, his work performance, any complaints against him, his social media activity, everywhere he goes, everyone he talks to. I want to know if he's cheating on his new girlfriend the way he cheated on me. Coco, that's pretty extensive surveillance. You talking about round the clock? I'm talking about turning David Davidson into the most documented man in San Diego. I want to know what he has for breakfast. That kind of investigation runs about $10,000 a week. Done. And Franklin, be discreet, but not invisible. I want him to start feeling like someone's watching him. Paranoia makes people sloppy. Coco drove home to her studio apartment, which suddenly felt ridiculous, like a disguise she no longer needed to wear. Tomorrow, she would start looking for a real home. Something appropriate for a woman of her new status. But tonight, she had phone calls to make. First, she called the Harrison couple in Phoenix directly. Mrs. Harrison, this is Coco Ben. I understand you might be interested in selling your La Jolla property. Oh, yes, dear. We've been trying to find the right buyer, but the market's been slow, and Charles needs specialized care. I'd like to make you an offer. $8 million, cash, closing in 2 weeks. Silence on the other end. Then, I'm sorry, did you say 8 million? The property appraised at 6.5. I'm offering 8. I can have the contracts to you tomorrow. Mrs. Ben, I don't understand. Why would you pay so much over asking? Coco smiled, looking out her small apartment window toward the direction of La Jolla. Because, Mrs. Harrison, some things are worth more than their appraised value. Sometimes you pay extra for the satisfaction. After she hung up, Coco poured herself a glass of wine, a $20 bottle that would soon be replaced by vintages David had never dreamed of affording, and opened her laptop. She had emails from her new financial team, her lawyers, her private investigator. She had property deeds to review, corporate structures to approve, surveillance reports to read. But first, she opened a new document and began typing. Project, Justice. Timeline, 12 months. Objective, complete financial and social destruction of David Davidson and associated parties through legal acquisition of all assets and business relationships that define their current lifestyle. Phase 1, Hartwell Industries acquisition. Phase 2, property acquisition and eviction. Phase 3, business network dismantling. Phase 4, social exposure and public humiliation. Coco paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Once she implemented this plan, there would be no going back. David would lose everything: his job, his home, his financial security, his reputation. Veronica would discover that her wealthy boyfriend was actually a broke, unemployed man with no prospects. The old Coco might have felt guilty. The old Coco might have wondered if she was becoming the monster David had always accused her of being during their worst fights. But the old Coco was gone, destroyed in a divorce attorney's office by a man who had promised to love and protect her forever. The new Coco saved the document and began making her next phone call. Victoria, it's Coco Ben again. I have another acquisition target. I want you to research every business that David Davidson's family members own or depend on. His brother's construction company, his sister's boutique, his cousin's restaurant. I want to know who holds their loans, who supplies their inventory, who controls their leases. Ms. Ben, that's quite an extensive. I told you, Victoria. I have $50 million to start. But what I really have is $153 million and a 15-year debt to collect. Coco hung up and looked around her tiny apartment one last time. Tomorrow, she would start hunting for a proper home. Next week, she would own David's workplace. Next month, she would own his house. By Christmas, David Davidson would understand exactly what it felt like to lose everything to someone he'd underestimated. The game had begun, and Coco Ben was playing to win everything. 6 weeks after Coco's transformation began, David Davidson sat in Michael Hartwell's office, his palms sweating despite the air conditioning. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, San Diego's skyline gleamed in the afternoon sun, but David couldn't shake the feeling that storm clouds were gathering. "David, I'll be direct," Michael said, his weathered hands folded on the mahogany desk. "We've received an acquisition offer. A substantial one." David's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as he set it down. "Acquisition. But sir, Hartwell Industries has been family-owned for 60 years. Your father, your grandfather. I'm 73 years old, David. Margaret wants to retire to Florida, and neither of my daughters has any interest in running a consulting firm." Michael's voice carried the weight of a man facing the end of an era. "The offer came through intermediaries, but it's legitimate. $48 million for a company that's probably worth $35 million on paper." David felt the floor shifting beneath him. Hartwell Industries wasn't just his employer, it was his identity. His business cards, his network, his reputation in San Diego's corporate community. Who's the buyer? That's the unusual part. It's coming through a series of shell companies. Very sophisticated structure. My lawyers say whoever's behind this has serious money and wants complete anonymity. Anonymous buyers. David's marketing mind immediately jumped to worst-case scenarios. "Sir, that could be anyone. Corporate raiders, foreign investors, someone planning to gut the company and sell off the pieces. Or someone who sees value in what we've built and wants to preserve it." Michael leaned back in his chair. "David, I'm not getting any younger. This offer gives me a chance to retire comfortably and ensures the company's future. The buyer's representatives have made guarantees about maintaining current operations for at least 2 years." David's phone buzzed with a text from Veronica. "Pool party at Madison's tonight. Wear the blue shirt that makes your eyes pop. Blue heart." The casual nature of her message felt surreal against the backdrop of his professional world crumbling. While he was facing potential unemployment, Veronica was planning pool parties with her trust fund friends. "Sir, what about the employees? What about our client relationships? I've spent 8 years building my portfolio here. Which is exactly why I want to discuss your future with the company." Michael pulled out a thick folder. "The acquiring party has requested detailed information about all senior employees. Your performance reviews, client relationships, revenue generation. It's standard due diligence." David nodded, but something cold settled in his stomach. He thought about his performance over the past year. The clients he'd lost to digital agencies, the budget overruns on the Morrison campaign, the increasingly tense meetings where Michael questioned his strategic decisions. "When will you make your decision?" "Soon. Maybe very soon." Michael's expression was unreadable. "David, I want you to know that whatever happens, you've been a valuable part of this company." The past tense wasn't lost on David. That evening, David sat by the infinity pool at the La Jolla mansion, watching Veronica and her friends laugh and splash in the water. Madison Chen, daughter of some tech entrepreneur. Brittany Powell, whose father owned half the restaurants in Gaslamp Quarter. Girls who'd never worried about job security or mortgage payments or the gap between their lifestyle and their actual income. "David, you look so serious." Veronica climbed out of the pool, water dripping from her perfect figure. "Come swim with us." "Work stuff," David said, forcing a smile. "Nothing important." But it was important. The rental on this house was $8,000 a month. His Mercedes payment was $1,200. Veronica's shopping habits averaged $4,000 monthly. His entire lifestyle was built on a foundation that suddenly seemed fragile. His phone rang. His brother Jake's name appeared on the screen. "Jake. What's up?" "David, something weird is happening with the business." Jake's construction company had been struggling since the recession, but he'd managed to keep it afloat with small residential projects. Remember that big development contract I told you about? The one that was going to save my ass. Yeah, the Coastal Vista project. You said it was a sure thing. It was. Contract signed, deposits paid, construction schedule approved. Then today, out of nowhere, they terminated. Breach of contract, they are claiming. But David, I read that contract 100 times. There's no way I breached anything. David felt that cold sensation spreading. What reason did they give? That's the thing, they won't say. Just that circumstances have changed, and they're restructuring their contractor relationships. The lawyer they sent to my office looked like he cost more per hour than I make in a week. Jake, I'm sure there's an explanation. There's more. The suppliers I use for materials? 3 of them called today saying they're changing their credit terms. Cash up front only. David, I've been working with these guys for 10 years. They've never demanded cash up front. Across the pool, Veronica was showing Madison her new Cartier watch, a gift David had bought her last week using the bonus from a client contract that now seemed increasingly precarious. Maybe it's just coincidence, David said, but the words felt hollow. And Maria's boutique got some kind of inspection yesterday. Health department, fire marshal, building code enforcement. All on the same day. She's been in business for 5 years with no problems, and suddenly she's facing $15,000 in compliance fees. Maria was their sister, whose clothing boutique catered to wealthy wives in Rancho Santa Fe. Another family business that had been stable until suddenly it wasn't. David, it feels like someone's targeting the family. But who would do that? We don't have enemies. We're not important enough to have enemies. David thought about Coco, living in her studio apartment, working at some pottery studio for minimum wage. Coco, who'd walked away from their divorce with nothing but clothes and a beat-up Toyota. Coco, who couldn't afford to fight him for a fair settlement, much less orchestrate some kind of business campaign against his family. I'm probably being paranoid, Jake continued. But David, if something's happening to your job too. My job is fine, David lied. Hartwell's solid. I'm solid. After he hung up, David stared at the pool where Veronica and her friends were playing some drinking game involving expensive tequila. None of them had ever worried about anything more serious than which yacht to charter for the weekend. His phone buzzed with another call. This time it was his accountant. David, we need to talk about your tax situation. What about it? The IRS has flagged your return for audit. Complete examination, 3 years back. They want documentation for every deduction, every business expense, every charitable contribution. David's hands went numb. That's random, right? The IRS audits people randomly. Usually. But this feels different. They are asking very specific questions about expense categories that are typically overlooked. Like they have inside information about your spending patterns. What kind of questions? Entertainment expenses that might be classified as personal rather than business. Vehicle usage calculations. The home office deduction you took while you were married. David thought about the receipts Coco had meticulously organized during their marriage. Coco, who had managed their finances, who knew every deduction they'd ever taken, every gray area they'd navigated. How long does an audit typically take? 6 months to 2 years. And David, you might want to get a tax attorney. This level of scrutiny usually means they think they'll find something. David hung up and looked around the mansion that suddenly felt like a house of cards. The pool, the view, the lifestyle he'd thought he'd earned. All of it dependent on income that was looking less secure by the hour. Veronica noticed his expression and paddled over to the pool's edge. Baby, you look stressed. Come in the water. Madison was just telling us about this amazing spa in Napa we should visit next weekend. Veronica, we might need to talk about cutting back on expenses for a while. She laughed, that musical sound that had once charmed him and now grated against his nerves. David, you're so funny. Cut back on what? We don't spend that much. David looked at her Cartier watch, her designer bikini, her highlighted hair that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Around the pool, her friends were drinking wine that cost $200 a bottle and planning European vacations like they were grocery shopping trips. I'm serious. Work is getting complicated, Anne. Then quit and find something better. Veronica's eyes sparkled with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences. You're brilliant. You could work anywhere you wanted. David wanted to explain that the job market wasn't that simple, that his industry was consolidating, that being unemployed at 43 was different than being unemployed at 23. But looking at Veronica's expectant face, he realized she lived in a world where problems solved themselves and money appeared when needed. "You're right," he said finally. "I'm probably worrying over nothing." But as he lay awake that night, listening to Veronica's peaceful breathing beside him, David couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed new life was built on quicksand. Somewhere in San Diego, Coco Ben was probably falling asleep on her narrow couch, exhausted from her pottery classes and retail job, dreaming of a future that didn't include humiliation and betrayal. David almost envied her simplicity. If only he knew that at that exact moment, Coco was actually reviewing acquisition contracts in her new penthouse office, coordinating with private investigators across 3 states, and planning the next phase of an operation that would leave David Davidson with nothing but the clothes on his back and a profound understanding of what it meant to be truly powerless. 3 months after Coco's transformation began, David Davidson received the call that shattered his world at 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. He was sitting in his office at Hartwell Industries, reviewing client proposals that felt increasingly pointless, when Michael Hartwell summoned him to the conference room. "David, please sit down." Michael's voice carried a heaviness that made David's stomach clench. "I've accepted the acquisition offer." The words hit like a physical blow. "Sir, I thought we had more time to." The buyers accelerated their timeline. They've completed due diligence faster than anyone thought possible. Michael slid a folder across the table. "David, I need to be direct with you. The new ownership has decided to restructure the senior management team." David opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside was a termination agreement, a severance package, and a non-disclosure agreement. The severance was generous, 6 months' salary, but it felt like payment for his own execution. "They are firing me." David's voice came out smaller than he intended. "They are transitioning to a different operational model. Digital first, younger demographic focus. Your client portfolio, while valuable, doesn't align with their strategic direction." David thought about his 8 years at Hartwell, the relationships he'd built, the reputation he'd cultivated. Who else is being transitioned? Most of the senior staff. They are bringing in their own team. Michael's expression was genuinely sympathetic. "David, this isn't a reflection of your work. It's business." But it felt personal. Devastatingly personal. David signed the papers with a hand that shook so badly he could barely form his signature. As he cleaned out his office, packing 15 years of career achievements into cardboard boxes, he called Veronica. "Baby, I have news. I'm leaving Hartwell." "Leaving? Did you get a better offer?" Her voice was bright with excitement. "Not exactly. The company was sold. I was let go." Silence. Then, let go? "You mean, fired?" "Laid off. Restructured. The severance is good, and I'll find something else quickly." "David, this is not happening. We have the charity gala next week, and I already told everyone you were sponsoring a table. Madison's father is expecting to meet you." "Veronica, I just lost my job. The gala is the least of our concerns." "No, this is not how this works." Her voice turned sharp, revealing something ugly beneath her usual sweetness. "You're supposed to be successful. That's the whole point." David felt something cold settle in his chest. "The whole point of what?" "Of us. Of this." She paused, and David could hear her breathing. "David, I didn't sign up to date an unemployed man." The line went dead. David sat in his empty office, surrounded by boxes, and felt the first crack in his carefully constructed new life split wide open. 2 hours later, as David loaded his belongings into his Mercedes, his phone rang again. The landlord for the La Jolla mansion. "Mr. Davidson, this is Robert Chen from Harrison Property Management. I have some unfortunate news about your rental property." David's hands went numb. "What kind of news?" "The owners have decided to sell. The new buyers are taking immediate possession. I'm afraid we'll need you to vacate by the end of the month." "That's impossible. We have a lease through next year." "Actually, sir, if you review your lease agreement, you'll find there's a clause allowing termination with 30 days' notice in case of property sale. The new owners have invoked that clause." David thought about the lease he'd signed in a rush, eager to impress Veronica with the mansion's luxury. He hadn't read the fine print carefully. "Who bought the property?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss the buyer's identity. But the sale was cash, well above asking price. The owners couldn't refuse." David hung up and sat in his car in the Hartwell Industries parking lot. Former Hartwell Industries, he corrected himself, trying to process the mathematics of his disaster. No job. No house. A girlfriend who'd just revealed she was more interested in his success than in him. His phone buzzed with a text from Jake. Emergency family meeting tonight. Mom's house. Something's happening to all of us. That evening, David sat around Patricia's kitchen table with his siblings, feeling like they were planning a funeral. Jake looked haggard, Maria was crying, and their mother kept wringing her hands in her lap. It's not coincidence, Jake said, his voice flat with exhaustion. Someone is systematically destroying our businesses. That's impossible, David said, but the words felt hollow. Who would do that? We're not important enough. David, listen to the timeline. Maria pulled out a notebook where she'd been tracking events. First, Jake's contracts get terminated and his suppliers change terms. Then my boutique gets hit with inspections and compliance fees. Then you lose your job and your house. The house is separate. Market forces. No. Jake's voice was sharp. I talked to my lawyer. The company that terminated my contracts. They are owned by something called Meridian Holdings. The suppliers who changed my credit terms. Their financing comes from Meridian Holdings. Maria's landlord just got bought by Meridian Holdings, David finished, feeling pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Patricia spoke for the first time since they'd arrived. There's something else. The insurance company called today. They are reviewing my coverage because of irregularities in my claims history. The irregularities are from 15 years ago, when I had cancer. Claims that were approved and closed. The room fell silent except for the ticking of Patricia's grandmother clock. Someone with serious money is targeting our family, Jake said. But David, you're the one with the high-profile job and expensive lifestyle. You're the one who might have made enemies. David thought about his clients, his competitors, his business relationships. He thought about Hartwell's acquisition and the anonymous buyers who'd known exactly how to dismantle the company's senior management. The divorce, Patricia said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. Coco, your divorce was ugly, David. Public. Humiliating for her. David felt a laugh bubbling up from somewhere dark and hysterical. Mom, Coco is working at a pottery studio. She lives in a studio apartment. She couldn't afford a decent lawyer, much less orchestrate corporate acquisitions. You didn't see her at the hospital, Patricia continued. When I had my heart attack, she was different. Calm. Confident. Like she knew something we didn't. Coco Ben is not some criminal mastermind, David said. She's a broke pottery teacher who... His phone rang. Veronica's name appeared on the screen. David, I've been thinking about what happened today. Her voice was different, cooler, more calculated. I think we should take a break. A break. You need time to figure out your career situation. And I need time to think about what I want. Madison's having a party this weekend in Malibu, and I think it would be good for me to get some space. Veronica, we can work through this. David, let's be realistic. You're unemployed, you're losing your house, and your family seems to be having some kind of business crisis. That's not the life I want. So you're leaving me because I lost my job. I'm leaving you because you're not who I thought you were. I thought you were successful, stable, someone who could provide the lifestyle I deserve. The honesty was brutal in its clarity. I see, David said quietly. I'll come by tomorrow to get my things. I left some jewelry in the bedroom safe. Make sure that's available. After she hung up, David looked around the table at his family. His mother fighting insurance companies over decade-old claims, his brother watching his construction business crumble, his sister facing bankruptcy from compliance fees, all of them staring at him like he held answers he didn't have. There has to be an explanation, David said. Coco doesn't have the resources or connections to do this. It's impossible. But even as he said it, David was remembering things. Coco's meticulous attention to detail. Her quiet intelligence that he'd dismissed as ordinary. The way she'd managed their household finances, their social calendar, their entire life with an efficiency he'd taken for granted. Coco, who knew every detail of his business relationships because she'd organized his client dinners for 8 years. Coco, who knew his family's business weaknesses because she'd helped them through financial crises. Coco, who understood his spending patterns, his tax strategies, his professional vulnerabilities better than anyone alive. Coco, who'd sat quietly in that divorce attorney's office while he destroyed her life, accepting his cruelty with a composure that had surprised him at the time. David. Maria was looking at him strangely. You look like you've seen a ghost. David thought about the lottery ticket he'd seen Coco buy the morning after their divorce, a desperate gesture from a woman with nothing left to lose. He thought about the timing of everything that had happened since then. I need to go, David said, standing abruptly. Where? Jake called after him. I need to check on something. David drove through San Diego in his Mercedes, probably one of the last times he'd be able to afford the payment, toward the neighborhood where Coco was living. He needed to see her studio apartment, her poverty, her ordinary life. He needed proof that his ex-wife was exactly who he thought she was, a broke, powerless woman who couldn't possibly be the architect of his destruction. But as he pulled up to the address he'd memorized from the divorce papers, David found something that made his world tilt off its axis entirely. The building was there. The apartment number was correct. But according to the mailbox directory, Unit 314 was vacant. Had been vacant for over 2 months. Coco Ben no longer lived there. In fact, according to the building manager David sweet-talked into checking records, Coco Ben had never lived there at all. David sat in his car outside the empty building, staring at an address that should have contained his ex-wife's new life, and realized he didn't know who Coco Ben really was anymore. Or perhaps, he was beginning to understand. He had never known her at all. David Davidson had never understood the phrase rock bottom, until he found himself living in a Motel 6 in Mission Valley, eating gas station sandwiches while watching his former life disintegrate on social media. 3 weeks had passed since discovering Coco's empty apartment. 3 weeks of obsessive investigation that had yielded nothing but deeper questions and mounting paranoia. He sat on the scratchy polyester bedspread, laptop balanced on his knees, scrolling through LinkedIn profiles of former colleagues who were already posting about their exciting new positions at the company that had acquired Hartwell Industries. The company that had specifically requested his termination. His phone buzzed with another call from Jake. David, we need to talk. Now. I'm at the motel. You know which one. I'll be there in 20 minutes. And David, don't go anywhere. We found something. Jake arrived looking like he'd aged 5 years in 3 weeks. His construction company had officially filed for bankruptcy the day before, after a cascade of contract cancellations and supplier demands that had drained his operating capital completely. David, I hired a private investigator. Jake sat heavily in the motel's single chair. Cost me the last $1,500 in my business account, but I had to know. What did you find? Jake pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. Meridian Holdings. The company that's been destroying us? It's a shell company. Owned by another shell company. Which is owned by another shell company. The investigator traced it through 7 layers before hitting a wall. David's hands shook as he opened the folder. Corporate filings, ownership documents, financial transfers, all leading in circles. 7 layers. David, whoever set this up has serious money and serious legal help. We're not talking about some angry ex-wife with a grudge. This is sophisticated corporate warfare. David studied the documents, his marketing background helping him recognize the elegant complexity of the structure. This would cost hundreds of thousands just to set up. Coco doesn't have that kind of money. Are you sure about that? David looked up sharply. What do you mean? The investigator found something else. Coco Ben hasn't used her credit cards in 4 months. Hasn't made a withdrawal from her bank account. Hasn't been seen at the pottery studio where she supposedly works. David, it's like she disappeared the day after your divorce. People don't just disappear. Rich people do. When they want privacy. Jake leaned forward. David, what if Coco isn't poor? What if she was never poor? What if everything we thought we knew about her financial situation was wrong? David felt something cold spreading through his chest. He thought about Coco's careful budgeting during their marriage, her insistence on saving money, her refusal to spend on luxury items. What if that hadn't been poverty? What if it had been strategy? She didn't have family money, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. I knew her background. Did you? David, when's the last time you actually paid attention to Coco's life? Her family, her finances, her activities. David opened his mouth to answer and realized he couldn't. Somewhere during their marriage, Coco had become background noise in his own life story. He'd stopped asking about her day, her dreams, her concerns. She'd managed their household so efficiently that he'd forgotten she was a person with her own complexity. The investigator is going to keep digging, Jake continued. But David, if this is Coco, We need to figure out what she wants. Money. Public humiliation. Complete destruction. Before David could answer, his phone rang. The number was blocked. Hello, David. The voice hit him like ice water. Calm, controlled, familiar, but different. Confident in a way Coco's voice had never been during their marriage. Coco. David's hand gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles went white. Where are you? I think the better question is, how are you, David? I heard about Hartwell Industries. Such a shame when companies get acquired by more efficient operators. Jake was frantically gesturing for David to put the call on speaker. David complied with shaking hands. Coco, if you're behind what's happening to my family. Your family? Coco's laugh was musical, but cold. David, I seem to remember you making it very clear that I was no longer part of your family. What was it you said? That I should be grateful for the fresh start. Coco, listen. No, David. You listen. For 15 years, I listened to you dismiss my intelligence, my contributions, my worth. I listened to you explain why we couldn't afford things for me while you spent freely on your own interests. I listened to you tell our friends that I was just a housewife who played with clay. David felt sweat beading on his forehead. Coco's voice carried a steel he'd never heard before. I want you to know, she continued, that every morning when I wake up, I think about that moment in the lawyer's office when you laughed at me. When you called me mediocre. When you decided that humiliating me publicly would be entertaining. Coco, I was angry. I said things. You said exactly what you believed. And now, David, I'm going to show you what mediocrity actually looks like. The line went dead. Jake stared at the phone. David, that woman just declared war on you. David's hands were shaking uncontrollably. She can't have that kind of money. It's impossible. David, think. Really think. What do you actually know about Coco's finances during your marriage? David tried to remember. Coco had handled their household budget, their taxes, their investments. She'd been meticulous about record keeping, strategic about spending, always focused on long-term planning rather than immediate gratification. She managed our money, David said slowly. All of it. I never paid attention to the details. Did she have her own accounts? I think so. For her pottery business. David felt his world shifting again. Jake, what if she was hiding money during our marriage? What if she'd been planning this for years? Or, Jake said quietly, what if something happened after your divorce that changed her financial situation completely? David's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Check your email. David opened his laptop with trembling fingers. In his inbox was a message from a generic Gmail account with a subject line that made his blood freeze. A gift. David, I wanted you to understand the scope of what's happening to you, so I'm sharing some information that might clarify your situation. Hartwell Industries was acquired by Aurora Consulting Group, which is owned by Meridian Holdings, which is ultimately controlled by the Ben Family Trust. I now own the company where you worked for 8 years. The La Jolla mansion you were renting belonged to Charles and Ruth Harrison, an elderly couple in Phoenix. I purchased their property for $8 million, 40% above market value, because I wanted you to experience what it felt like to lose your home with 30 days' notice. Your brother Jake's construction contracts were terminated because I acquired controlling interests in the development companies that hired him. Maria's boutique is facing compliance issues because I purchased the building she rents and the companies that supply her inventory. Your IRS audit is proceeding because I provided them with detailed documentation of every questionable deduction you've taken in the past 5 years. Documentation I compiled while managing our household finances. Your mother's insurance review is happening because I own 17% of her insurance company's parent corporation. David, this is not revenge. This is education. You are learning what it feels like to have your life dismantled by someone you underestimated. The process is just beginning. Coco. P.S. Veronica's new boyfriend, Franklin, whom she met at Madison's party last weekend. His family's investment firm just signed a management contract with the Ben Family Trust. Small world. David read the email 3 times before the words fully registered. Jake was reading over his shoulder, his face growing paler with each paragraph. David, Jake whispered, how much money would someone need to do all of this? David's mind was racing through calculations. Acquiring companies, purchasing real estate, buying corporate stakes, hiring law firms sophisticated enough to create 7-layer shell company structures. Hundreds of millions. Maybe more. Where the hell did Coco get hundreds of millions of dollars? David thought about the lottery ticket he'd seen Coco buy the morning after their divorce. The desperate gesture of a woman with nothing left to lose. The timing that had seemed like pathetic optimism at the time. Jake, David said slowly, what were the winning lottery numbers the week after our divorce? Jake pulled out his phone and started searching. Powerball, 4 months ago. Jesus Christ, David. What? $257 million jackpot. Single winner. Winner chose to remain anonymous. The motel room felt like it was spinning. David stared at his laptop screen, Coco's email still open, and understood that he wasn't just facing an angry ex-wife with a grudge. He was facing a woman with $250 million and 15 years of accumulated rage. David, Jake's voice was hollow. What did you do to her? David thought about the divorce proceedings. The way he'd stripped Coco of everything she'd helped build during their marriage. The public humiliation. The dismissive comments about her intelligence and worth. The laughter. I destroyed her, David said quietly. In front of witnesses. I made sure she left with nothing. And now she's returning the favor. David's phone buzzed with another message. Tomorrow, check the news. You'll want to see what happens when someone underestimates Coco Ben. That night, David lay awake on the motel bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling and trying to comprehend the magnitude of his situation. Coco hadn't just won the lottery. She'd used that money to construct an elaborate, methodical campaign of destruction specifically designed to make him experience everything he'd put her through. But it was more than that. Coco was showing him, and anyone paying attention, that she wasn't the mediocre, powerless woman he'd portrayed her as. She was demonstrating strategic thinking, financial sophistication, and operational capabilities that made his 8-year marketing career look like child's play. At 3 a.m., David finally understood the true scope of his mistake. He hadn't just divorced Coco. He'd humiliated a woman who was apparently smarter, more resourceful, and more strategic than he'd ever given her credit for. A woman who had now dedicated vast resources to teaching him exactly how wrong he'd been about her capabilities. David pulled out his phone and typed a text. Coco, please. We need to talk. I understand now. I was wrong about everything. He stared at the message for 10 minutes before deleting it. Coco Ben wasn't interested in his apologies. She was interested in his education. And based on her email, the lesson was just beginning. Outside his motel window, San Diego glittered in the darkness. A city where Coco Ben now owned pieces of his former life, controlled aspects of his family's future, and wielded power he was only beginning to comprehend. David closed his eyes and tried to imagine what tomorrow's news would bring. Whatever it was, he knew it would be devastating. David woke at dawn to his phone buzzing incessantly. News alerts, text messages, missed calls. His screen was a chaos of notifications. The first headline he saw made his blood freeze. Mystery billionaire Coco Ben announces $100 million charitable foundation. David's hands shook as he opened the article. There was Coco's photo, but not the Coco he remembered. This woman wore a tailored designer suit, her hair styled by professionals, her makeup flawless. She stood in what appeared to be a penthouse office overlooking San Diego Bay, radiating confidence and power. Coco Ben, founder of the Ben Family Trust, announced yesterday the launch of the Coco Ben Foundation for Women's Economic Empowerment. The foundation will provide business loans, educational scholarships, and legal aid to women rebuilding their lives after divorce. Ms. Ben, who recently emerged as one of California's most significant philanthropists, declined to discuss the source of her wealth but emphasized her personal connection to the foundation's mission. I understand what it's like to have everything taken from you, Ben told reporters. I understand what it's like to be told you're worthless, mediocre, disposable. This foundation exists to show women that those judgments are wrong. The article continued with details about Coco's other recent acquisitions, properties throughout San Diego, stakes in major corporations, a private jet, a mansion in Rancho Santa Fe. David scrolled through photos of Coco cutting ribbons, shaking hands with politicians, signing checks for millions of dollars. His phone rang. Jake's name appeared on the screen. David, are you seeing this? I'm seeing it. David's voice was hollow. She's not just rich, David. She's powerful. Look at who's standing with her in these photos. The mayor, 3 city council members, the CEO of San Diego Trust Bank. She's connected now. David studied the photos more carefully. Coco was surrounded by people he recognized from his former professional circles. People who would have taken his calls a month ago, people who now probably saw him as a cautionary tale. Jake, there's something else. Look at the Foundation's mission statement. David found the Foundation's website and read aloud. The Coco Ben Foundation specifically supports women who have been publicly humiliated, financially exploited, or emotionally destroyed by divorce proceedings. We believe every woman deserves the opportunity to rebuild her life with dignity and power. David, she's not just destroying you. She's making you the poster child for why her foundation needs to exist. David's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Coffee? Seaport Village, 10 a.m. Come alone. 2 hours later, David sat at a waterfront cafe in Seaport Village, wearing clothes from a discount store and driving Jake's 10-year-old Honda because his Mercedes had been repossessed the week before. He watched tourists enjoying their vacations, families taking photos, couples holding hands, normal people living normal lives while his world had become a nightmare. Coco arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, stepping out of a black Tesla driven by what appeared to be a professional driver. She wore a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than David's monthly motel rent, and her presence commanded attention from everyone in the cafe. She sat across from David without ceremony, her brown eyes, once so familiar, now studying him with the detached interest of a scientist observing a specimen. You look tired, David. You look. David struggled for words. Different. I look like myself. Finally. Coco signaled the waitress. Coffee, black. And David, order whatever you'd like. I'm buying. The casual power in that gesture, Coco Ben buying David Davidson coffee, would have been absurd 4 months ago. Now it felt like another small humiliation in an endless series. Coco, I need to understand what you want from me. What I want? Coco smiled, but there was no warmth in it. David, I want you to experience clarity. The same clarity I had sitting in that lawyer's office while you stripped away 15 years of my life and laughed about it. I was angry. You were honest. Maybe for the first time in our marriage. Coco leaned forward slightly. You showed me who you really thought I was. Mediocre. Worthless. Disposable. Someone you'd settled for. David felt heat rising in his cheeks. Coco, I loved you. You loved having me manage your life while you took credit for everything I built. Coco's voice remained calm, but her words cut like surgical instruments. You loved having someone organize your social calendar, manage your finances, maintain your household, and ask for nothing in return except basic respect. That's not fair. Fair. Coco laughed, a sound that made David's skin crawl because it was exactly like her laugh in the lawyer's office. David, let me tell you about fair. Fair would have been splitting our assets equitably after 15 years of marriage. Fair would have been acknowledging my contributions to your career. Fair would have been treating me with dignity during our divorce. Coco pulled out her phone and scrolled to something. Instead, you gave me this. She showed David a recording app. His own voice filled the small space between them. Sign the papers, Coco, and maybe I'll let you keep the Toyota. Actually, on second thought, Veronica needs a car for her yoga classes. You can take the bus. David felt nauseous. Other cafe patrons were starting to stare. You recorded our divorce proceedings. I recorded everything, David. Every cruel comment, every dismissive laugh, every moment you chose to humiliate me instead of treating me like a human being. Coco put her phone away. Those recordings are quite valuable now. Media outlets are very interested in the backstory of San Diego's newest philanthropist. David understood the threat immediately. Coco, please. Please what? Please don't show the world who you really are. Please don't let people hear how you treated the woman who stood by you for 15 years. Coco leaned back in her chair, studying David's face. I'm going to give you a choice, David. One choice. The only choice you'll get. David's mouth went dry. What choice? Tomorrow night, I'm hosting a charity gala at the Grand Del March. 500 guests, including everyone who matters in San Diego business and politics. The people who used to respect you. The people whose opinions you valued, the people who define success in your world. Coco paused to sip her coffee, letting the tension build. I'm going to tell my story to those 500 people. I'm going to explain how I went from being married to a man who called me mediocre to becoming one of the most powerful women in California. I'm going to share my journey from humiliation to triumph. Coco, your choice is this: you can attend that gala. You can stand up in front of those 500 people and publicly acknowledge what you did to me. You can apologize, genuinely, completely, specifically, for the way you treated me during our marriage and divorce. You can admit that you were wrong about my worth, my intelligence, my capabilities. David felt his chest tightening. And if you do that, I'll stop. Your family's businesses will recover. Your mother's insurance issues will resolve. I'll even help you find new employment, something appropriate for a man with your actual skill level. And if I don't? Coco's smile was radiant and terrifying. If you don't, David, I continue. Your family loses everything. Your mother loses her home paying for medical expenses her insurance won't cover. Jake declares personal bankruptcy. Maria closes her boutique. And you become a case study in what happens when someone mistakes kindness for weakness. David stared at Coco, trying to find some trace of the woman he'd married. The woman who'd forgiven his small cruelties, overlooked his selfishness, supported his dreams while sacrificing her own. You're asking me to destroy myself publicly. I'm asking you to tell the truth publicly. There's a difference. Coco stood gracefully. David, for 15 years, I made myself smaller so you could feel bigger. I hid my intelligence so you could feel smart. I diminished my worth so you could feel valuable. She placed a $20 bill on the table, a tip that was probably more than David had spent on food in the past week. Tomorrow night, you have the opportunity to finally see me as I actually am. And more importantly, you have the opportunity to finally be honest about who you actually are. Coco started to walk away, then turned back. Oh, and David. Veronica will be there. With Franklin. I thought you should know. Coco left David sitting alone at the cafe, watching her Tesla disappear into traffic. Around him, life continued normally. Tourists laughed, families enjoyed their meals, couples made plans for the future. David pulled out his phone and stared at Coco's contact information. 24 hours ago, he'd thought he was fighting for his survival. Now he understood he was fighting for his soul. The choice Coco had given him wasn't really about money or business or even revenge. It was about whether David Davidson was capable of the one thing he'd never given Coco during their 15-year marriage: complete, public honesty about who he really was. David thought about his family, about his mother facing financial ruin, about Jake's children who might lose their home because of David's mistakes. He thought about 500 people watching him confess to being exactly the kind of man Coco's foundation existed to protect women from. He thought about Veronica, who would be there with her new boyfriend, witnessing David's complete humiliation. Most of all, he thought about Coco, not the powerless woman he'd divorced, but the strategic mastermind who had spent 4 months proving that his judgment about her worth had been catastrophically wrong. David finished his coffee and walked back to Jake's Honda, knowing that tomorrow night would either mark his redemption or his final destruction. The choice was his. For the first time in their relationship, Coco had given him all the power to decide his own fate. The irony was devastating. The Grand Del Mar Resort's ballroom had been transformed into something resembling a fairy tale. If fairy tales included 500 of San Diego's most powerful people gathered to witness either redemption or destruction. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables adorned with white roses and gold accents, while a string quartet played softly in the corner. David Davidson stood in the parking lot, wearing a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit, staring at the entrance and trying to summon courage he wasn't sure he possessed. Through the glass doors, he could see Coco moving gracefully between tables, greeting guests with the confidence of someone who belonged in rooms like this. She wore a midnight blue gown that probably cost more than his monthly motel rent, and every person she spoke with leaned in as though her words carried weight that mattered. David's phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Whatever you decide, we're behind you. Mom sends her love." Patricia had been released from the hospital that morning, facing insurance bills that would force her to sell the house where she'd raised her children. Jake's construction company had officially ceased operations, and Maria had received eviction notice for her boutique. Everything Coco had promised would happen was happening, methodically and legally. David straightened his borrowed tie and walked through the doors. The ballroom buzzed with the kind of conversation that happened when successful people gathered to celebrate success. David recognized faces from his former professional life, colleagues, clients, competitors who had once taken his calls and valued his opinions. Now their eyes slid past him as though he were invisible, or worse, as though they were embarrassed to acknowledge his presence. David Davidson. Michael Hartwell appeared at David's elbow, looking genuinely surprised. "I didn't expect to see you here. Coco invited me." The words felt strange in David's mouth. Ah! Michael's expression grew complicated. David, I hope you understand that the Hartwell acquisition, it wasn't personal. The new ownership had very specific ideas about staffing. I understand, Michael. Coco Ben is a very strategic thinker. Something in David's tone made Michael look at him more carefully. You know Ms. Ben? We were married for 15 years. Michael's face went through several expressions before settling on something approaching shock. Married? But she's rich, powerful, influential. David managed a bitter smile. Yes, she is. I didn't realize it at the time. Before Michael could respond, the lights dimmed slightly and a gentle chime indicated the evening's program was beginning. David found an empty chair at a back table, noting that his seat had no place card. Coco had left him to find his own place in this room, another small reminder of his status. Coco took the stage with the kind of presence that made 500 people fall silent without effort. She stood behind the podium like she'd been born to it, her hands steady, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system. Good evening, friends. Thank you for joining me tonight for the launch of the Coco Ben Foundation for Women's Economic Empowerment. Applause filled the room. David watched faces he recognized. Business leaders, politicians, socialites, all focused on Coco with the kind of attention usually reserved for celebrities or heads of state. 6 months ago, Coco continued, I was a woman who had lost everything. My marriage had ended, my financial security was gone, and I was facing a future that looked very different from the life I had planned. David felt sweat beading on his forehead. Around him, 500 people listened with rapt attention as Coco began telling their story. I had spent 15 years supporting my husband's career, managing our household, building the foundation that allowed him to pursue his professional goals. But when our marriage ended, I was told that my contributions had no value. I was told that I was mediocre, that I had been a burden, that I should be grateful for whatever small allowance I was given to start over. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. David saw people leaning forward, their faces showing the kind of sympathy usually reserved for victims of tragedy. I could have accepted that judgment. I could have believed that the person who knew me best was right about my worth. I could have disappeared into the kind of quiet desperation that affects so many women after divorce. Coco paused, her eyes scanning the room. David knew she could see him, sitting alone at the back table, but her expression gave nothing away. Instead, I discovered something about myself that 15 years of marriage had hidden. I am not mediocre. I am not a burden. I am not disposable. The applause was longer this time, more enthusiastic. David heard someone at a nearby table whisper, "What strength! What courage! The foundation we're launching tonight exists because I learned that my experience isn't unique." Every week, women contact our offices to share stories of marriages where they made themselves smaller so their husbands could feel bigger. Stories of divorce proceedings where their contributions were dismissed, their intelligence questioned, their worth denied. Coco clicked to the first slide of her presentation. Statistics about women's economic recovery after divorce, charts showing the financial disparity between men and women post-separation. David recognized some of the data from research Coco had done during their marriage for a pottery business plan he dismissed as unrealistic. But here's what I want you to understand about women like us, Coco said, her voice growing stronger. When you strip away everything we've built, when you force us to start over with nothing, when you publicly humiliate us for daring to believe we mattered, you don't destroy us. You reveal us. The room was completely silent now. David felt like Coco was speaking directly to him across the 500 people between them. You reveal our resilience, our intelligence, our capacity for strategic thinking that was always there but perhaps never fully appreciated. You reveal women who are far more capable than anyone, including themselves, ever imagined. Coco clicked to the next slide, a photo of herself from 6 months ago, leaving the divorce attorney's office, looking broken and defeated. The contrast with the woman standing confidently at the podium was dramatic. This foundation will provide business loans, educational opportunities, and legal support to women rebuilding their lives. But more than that, it will provide something I wished I'd had 6 months ago. Proof that other people's judgment of your worth is not the final word on who you are or what you can become. The applause was thunderous now. David watched people rising to their feet, their faces showing genuine emotion and admiration. Coco had turned her humiliation into heroism, her destruction into inspiration. But Coco wasn't finished. I want to share something with you tonight that I've never shared publicly. Coco's voice took on a more intimate tone. The day after my divorce was finalized, I bought a lottery ticket. Not because I believed in luck, but because I was desperate. Because for the first time in my adult life, I had no safety net, no plan, no clear path forward. David's chest tightened. He knew what was coming. That ticket won the Powerball jackpot. $257 million. Gasps and excited murmurs filled the room. Several people turned to look at companions with expressions of amazement. But here's what I realized in that moment. The money didn't change who I was. It only gave me the resources to become who I had always been, underneath 15 years of being told I wasn't enough. Coco paused, letting her words sink in. The money allowed me to start businesses, make investments, create the foundation we're celebrating tonight. But the woman standing before you, her intelligence, her strategic thinking, her capacity for leadership, she existed before the lottery ticket. She was just never allowed to fully emerge. More applause, but Coco raised her hand for silence. I tell you this story because there's someone in this room tonight who needs to hear it. Someone who was part of my journey from humiliation to empowerment. Someone who has the opportunity to demonstrate that people can grow, can learn, can become better than they were. David felt every muscle in his body tense. Around the room, he sensed people looking around, trying to identify who Coco was talking about. David, would you please stand up? The words hit the room like a physical force. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Servers froze with their trays. The string quartet's music faded to silence. David felt 500 pairs of eyes searching the room for him. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the table edge. This was it, the moment Coco had been building toward for 4 months. The moment of choice. He could sit there, refuse to acknowledge her, and watch his family's destruction continue. He could walk out, preserve what remained of his dignity, and accept that Coco Ben would win completely. Or he could stand up and face the truth about who he had been, who he was, and who he might become. David thought about Patricia, lying in her hospital bed, apologizing for cruelties she regretted. He thought about Jake, losing his business because of David's mistakes. He thought about Maria, facing eviction because David had chosen humiliation over respect during his divorce. He thought about Coco, sitting in that lawyer's office, signing papers that stripped away 15 years of her life while he laughed. David Davidson stood up. The room's attention focused on him like a spotlight. He saw recognition dawn on faces throughout the ballroom, former colleagues, clients, people who had known him during his marriage to Coco. He saw surprise, confusion, and in some cases, anticipation. Coco smiled at him from the stage, not the cold smile she'd given him at the cafe, but something warmer. Encouraging. As though she was genuinely hoping he would make the right choice. David, Coco said, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system. Would you like to share your perspective on the story I've been telling? David walked slowly toward the stage, each step feeling like a mile. The room remained silent except for the sound of his footsteps on the marble floor. When he reached the microphone Coco offered him, his hands were trembling visibly. He looked out at 500 faces, many of them familiar, all of them waiting to see what he would do. In the third row, he spotted Veronica sitting next to a man he didn't recognize. Franklin, presumably. Both of them watching with expressions of barely concealed anticipation. David cleared his throat and leaned toward the microphone. My name is David Davidson, he began, his voice shaky but carrying through the sound system. And I was married to Coco Ben for 15 years. He paused, looking at Coco, who nodded encouragingly. 6 months ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I treated the woman who had given me 15 years of love, support, and partnership like she was disposable. I publicly humiliated her, stripped her of everything she had helped build, and told her she was mediocre. The room was so quiet David could hear his own heartbeat. I was wrong. About everything. David's voice grew stronger as he continued. Coco Ben is the most intelligent, strategic, and capable person I have ever known. During our marriage, she managed our finances so well that I never had to worry about money. She organized our social life so efficiently that I was able to focus entirely on my career. She supported my dreams, covered for my mistakes, and made me look successful to the world. He looked directly at Coco, tears forming in his eyes. And when our marriage ended, instead of acknowledging her contributions, instead of treating her with the respect she had earned, I chose to destroy her. I chose cruelty over kindness. I chose my ego over her dignity. David turned back to the audience, many of whom were leaning forward with complete attention. The woman standing behind me didn't become remarkable because she won the lottery. She was always remarkable. I was just too arrogant, too selfish, and too stupid to see it. The applause started slowly, building as people throughout the room began to understand what they were witnessing. Coco Ben deserves every success she's achieved. She deserves recognition for her intelligence, respect for her capabilities, and admiration for her strength. What she doesn't deserve is to be defined by how badly I treated her. David's voice broke slightly on the last sentence. I'm sorry, Coco. I'm sorry for 15 years of taking you for granted. I'm sorry for the divorce proceedings where I tried to make you feel worthless. I'm sorry for every time I made you smaller so I could feel bigger. And I'm sorry it took losing everything to finally see who you really are. David stepped away from the microphone and walked back toward his table, but the applause stopped him. It started with a few people, then spread throughout the room, growing into a standing ovation that seemed to last forever. But David wasn't watching the audience. He was watching Coco, who had tears streaming down her face as she applauded his honesty. When the applause finally faded, Coco returned to the microphone. Thank you, David. That took tremendous courage. She looked out at the audience, her composure completely restored. The Coco Ben Foundation exists because women like me need to know that other people's judgment of our worth is not the final word on who we are. But tonight, David has shown us something equally important. People can change. They can grow. They can choose to become better than they were. Coco gestured toward David, who was still standing near his table. David Davidson spent 4 months learning what it feels like to lose everything, to be dismissed and underestimated, to have your worth questioned by people who once respected you. It was a difficult education, but a necessary one. She paused, letting her words sink in. Tomorrow, David will begin rebuilding his life. The Ben Foundation will provide him with career counseling, business connections, and the support he needs to discover who he can be when he's not trying to diminish someone else. The room erupted in applause again, but this time it felt different, hopeful rather than triumphant. Coco smiled at David across the room, and for the first time in 6 months, he saw traces of the woman he had married. The woman who believed in second chances, who chose forgiveness over revenge, who understood that love sometimes meant helping someone become better than they thought they could be. The woman you laughed at, Coco said, echoing the phrase that had haunted David for months, now owns everything you ever loved. But more importantly, she chooses to use that power to lift others up rather than tear them down. Coco raised her champagne glass in a toast. To second chances. To women's empowerment. And to the courage it takes to admit when you're wrong and choose to become better. 500 people raised their glasses in response, and David Davidson finally understood that Coco Ben had given him something far more valuable than revenge. She had given him the chance to become the man he should have been all along. 6 months after the charity gala, David Davidson sat in the lobby of Ben Consulting Group, the business development firm Coco had created specifically for people rebuilding their professional lives. The offices occupied an entire floor of a downtown San Diego high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the harbor where Coco's foundation had just broken ground on a women's entrepreneurship center. David wore a suit that actually fit, not designer, but respectable, and carried a portfolio containing the business plan he'd spent 3 months developing under the guidance of Coco's career counselors. Today was his final meeting before launching Davidson Strategic Services, a consulting firm focused on helping small businesses navigate digital transformation. David. Coco's assistant smiled warmly. Ms. Ben will see you now. Coco's office was elegant but not ostentatious, modern furniture, local artwork, and family photos that included shots of her with women whose businesses the foundation had helped launch. She looked up from her computer as David entered, her expression professional but kind. How are you feeling about tomorrow's launch? Coco asked, gesturing for David to sit across from her desk. Terrified, David admitted. But excited. I haven't felt excited about work in years. Coco reviewed the documents in David's portfolio, financial projections, client acquisition strategies, operational plans. Her feedback over the months had been invaluable, though David suspected she was holding back the full extent of her business acumen to let him develop his own capabilities. Your approach to the Morrison account is particularly strong, Coco noted. Small businesses need exactly this kind of strategic support, and you've identified a genuine market gap. I learned from watching the best, David said, then caught himself. Coco, I hope that doesn't sound presumptuous. David, you can acknowledge my skills without it being weird. We're past that. Coco closed the portfolio. Your loan application has been approved. The Foundation's Business Development Fund is prepared to provide your startup capital. David felt a familiar twist of emotion, gratitude mixed with the strange irony of his ex-wife funding his new career. Coco, I know this situation is unusual. It's exactly what the Foundation exists for. You've done the work, demonstrated genuine change, and developed a viable business plan. The fact that I know you personally makes me more confident in the investment, not less. Coco stood and walked to her window, looking out at the San Diego skyline. David, can I ask you something? Of course. Are you happy? The question surprised him. David thought about his new apartment, modest but comfortable. His relationship with his family, rebuilt on honesty rather than financial success. His work developing a business that felt meaningful rather than just profitable. Yes, he said, realizing it was true. I'm happier than I've been in years. Maybe decades. Good. That was always the goal. Coco. David struggled with how to phrase his next question. Do you ever regret it? Not the divorce, but everything after. The campaign. The public exposure. It must have consumed so much of your time and energy. Coco turned from the window, considering his question seriously. David, for 15 years, I watched you build a life that made you miserable. Success without fulfillment, relationships without depth, achievements that left you feeling empty. I didn't want revenge. I wanted you to discover who you could be when you stopped trying to prove you were better than everyone else. And now you're building something that matters to you. You're treating people with respect. You're using your skills to help rather than exploit. Coco smiled. Now you're becoming the man I always believed you could be. David felt tears threatening. I wasted so many years. No, David. You learned. There's a difference. Coco's phone buzzed with a text. She glanced at it and smiled in a way that made David curious. Good news. My date tonight is confirming dinner plans. David felt a complicated mix of emotions. Happiness for Coco, residual sadness about their divorce, and genuine curiosity about who could match her intelligence and strength. Anyone I know. Dr. Franklin Chen, pediatric surgeon at Children's Hospital. He's brilliant, kind, and completely unintimidated by successful women. Coco's expression grew thoughtful. He knew about my money before we met, but he was more interested in my foundation work than my net worth. David remembered Franklin as Veronica's new boyfriend from the gala, then felt confused. Wait, isn't he? Veronica's ex, yes. Apparently, when she discovered he was more interested in his medical research than expensive vacations, she lost interest quickly. Coco laughed. She introduced us at a coffee shop 3 months ago, hoping to make you jealous. Instead, Franklin and I discovered we both love terrible sci-fi movies and have strong opinions about sustainable urban development. The irony was perfect. Veronica's attempt at manipulation had led to Coco finding genuine happiness. He sounds wonderful. He is. And David. He treats me like I'm exactly as intelligent and capable as I actually am. It's refreshing. David stood to leave, but Coco stopped him. There's something else. The Harrison property, your old rental house in La Jolla. David's stomach tightened. He'd driven past the mansion a few weeks ago and seen contractors renovating it extensively. I'm converting it into a residential facility for women leaving abusive marriages. 24 units, on-site counseling, job training programs, childcare services. It seemed like an appropriate use for a house where someone learned that wealth doesn't guarantee happiness. David felt the weight of symbolism. His former life of shallow luxury transformed into a sanctuary for women rebuilding their lives with substance and purpose. Coco, that's perfect. The grand opening is next month. I'd like you to be there, if you're comfortable with it. Not as my ex-husband, but as someone who understands transformation. I'd be honored. Coco walked David to her office door. One more thing. Patricia called yesterday. David's mother had been living in a new apartment since selling her house, but her medical bills were manageable now thanks to an anonymous benefactor who had quietly resolved her insurance issues. She wants to volunteer with the foundation. Apparently, she has strong opinions about how older women are treated during divorce proceedings, and she'd like to help develop our legal advocacy program. David smiled, imagining his mother channeling her protective instincts into helping other women navigate difficult transitions. She'll be excellent at that. David, your family doesn't blame you for what happened. They understand that sometimes people need to lose everything to discover what actually matters. As David rode the elevator down to street level, he reflected on the strange mathematics of his life. 6 months ago, he'd lost his job, his house, his girlfriend, and his illusions about himself. In return, he'd gained honesty, purpose, and relationships based on mutual respect rather than transactional benefit. His phone buzzed with a text from Jake. First client meeting went great. The school district wants to hire us for 3 more projects. Dad would be proud. Jake's new construction company specialized in building affordable housing and community centers. Maria's boutique had reopened in a smaller space, focusing on locally made sustainable fashion rather than expensive imports. Both businesses were smaller than before, but more meaningful. David walked through downtown San Diego toward his apartment, passing the harbor where Coco's Women's Center was rising from the waterfront. Construction workers were installing a sign that would read Coco Ben's Center for Women's Economic Empowerment, where every woman discovers her true worth. That evening, David sat on his apartment balcony with a simple dinner and a book about sustainable business practices. His phone rang with a call from his first client, a small family restaurant wanting help developing an online presence. The work wasn't glamorous, but it felt important. As the sun set over San Diego Bay, David thought about Coco, probably getting ready for her dinner with Franklin. He imagined her laughing at whatever terrible movie they'd chosen, planning foundation initiatives, living the kind of life she'd always deserved but had never been allowed to pursue during their marriage. David pulled out his phone and typed a text, "Thank you. For everything. For seeing who I could become even when I couldn't see it myself." Coco's response came quickly, "Thank you for becoming him. The world needs more people willing to grow." David smiled and deleted Coco's contact information from his phone. Not from anger or spite, but because their relationship had reached its proper conclusion. She was no longer his ex-wife or his benefactor or the woman who had orchestrated his downfall. She was simply Coco Ben, successful entrepreneur, philanthropist, and living proof that other people's judgment of your worth is never the final word on who you can become. 3 blocks away, Coco Ben sat in her Rancho Santa Fe home, a beautiful but comfortable house where she hosted foundation events and charity dinners, getting ready for her date with Franklin. On her dressing table sat a small ceramic vase she'd made during her pottery classes 15 years ago, back when David had dismissed her artistic interests as playing with mud. The vase now held white roses from her garden, and sometimes Coco looked at it and remembered the woman who had been afraid to take up space in her own life. That woman felt like a character from a story she'd once read, familiar but distant, someone she understood but no longer was. Coco's phone buzzed with David's text, and she smiled as she responded. Their story had reached the ending she'd always hoped for, not revenge, but transformation. Not destruction, but growth. As she drove to meet Franklin, Coco passed the billboard advertising the Ben Foundation's new initiative. Every woman has the power to rewrite her story. Below the text was a photo of Coco from the charity gala, confident and radiant, with a quote that had become the Foundation's unofficial motto. "You are not defined by how others treat you. You are defined by how you choose to rise." Coco Ben had risen. And in doing so, she'd helped David Davidson discover that he could rise too. Sometimes the best revenge is becoming so successful, so genuinely happy, and so fundamentally transformed that the person who hurt you barely recognizes the powerless victim they thought they'd destroyed. And sometimes, if you're lucky and brave enough to do the hard work of becoming better, that same success creates space for everyone to grow beyond who they used to be. Coco pulled into the restaurant parking lot where Franklin was waiting, his smile lighting up when he saw her. As she walked toward him, Coco thought about the lottery ticket that had changed everything, not because it made her rich, but because it gave her the resources to become who she had always been underneath 15 years of being told she wasn't enough. The woman they had laughed at now owned everything they had ever loved. But more importantly, she had learned how to use that power to lift others up rather than tear them down. And that, Coco thought as Franklin took her hand, was the kind of victory that actually mattered. What did this story teach you about the power of resilience and the possibility of transformation? Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that will change how you see the world.